Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Under the Microscope here on Music of the Mountains Jindo Dog Journeys. This series is where we spend some time taking an album from a band's discography that may be lesser known, less commercially successful, maybe a little bit of a dark horse album or a sleeper album, and stick it under the microscope for some analysis. And today we're going to look at this Iron Maiden, Somewhere in Time. All right, from 1986. I think it came out in September 1986. I have a vinyl version here. Front cover, back cover. There's the insert. It's got a band photograph of them on these. I guess they're supposed to be futuristic three-wheelers or four-wheelers. Maybe that was taken in, well, it looks kind of like the California desert, but I don't know. And there's the back of the insert with the lyrics and credits. It's a black vinyl. I think this was probably the 2015 remasters that they did. So, sounds really good. So to set the stage, so what was going on in the Iron Maiden camp before the release of this album in 1986? Well, the band had finished up an extensive tour in support of the Power Slave album. Power Slave was the 1984 album that really broke them in America. That was the album that really brought them into the heavy metal consciousness of Americans. And it was very successful. They did a very long tour in many, many different places that spanned months. And that tour is well documented on the live release from 1985 called Live After Death, which, if you haven't heard yet, I'd strongly recommend you give it a listen because it's a great live album. So after that, the band was exhausted after touring that extensively, and they needed a break. And you also got to remember that in their young career, they really hadn't taken a break up to that point. The first album, the self-titled album, came out in 1980, and they had released a new album every year up till then. So after the big tour in support of Power Slave, they finally took some time off. Had a few months, recuperated, whatever, and then regrouped. Began the sessions for Somewhere in Time, and I think that they recorded most of it in the Bahamas, and I think there was some other recording in another country. A couple of other interesting things about Somewhere in Time, the album, before we get into the songs, is that Bruce Dickinson has no writing credits on this album. He had apparently worked on some songs, and they were kind of acoustic based, and he wanted to experiment a little differently with the next Iron Maiden album and maybe go in some directions that the band hadn't previously explored yet. And I guess they did not collectively approve of that, or Steve Harris certainly didn't approve of it, because none of his contributions are on Somewhere in Time. Another interesting thing that appears on Somewhere in Time for the first time is the use of guitar synthesizers. And actually, I think this is maybe the only time that guitar synthesizers appeared on any Iron Maiden album, because like on the following album, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, I think it was just keyboards that they used to add these additional sonic textures to their arrangements. But here it is guitar synthesizers, and a guitar synthesizer is like this modification, often with a guitar pickup, that once a string is plucked or a note is played, it's going to produce a sound that emulates and replicates something that you would hear on a synthesizer or a keyboard. And if you were a guitar player that got into using multi-effects pedals in the 90s, like I did, you know that they'd have a smorgasbord of different options up on there, and usually some of the effects would sound like something you'd hear on a synthesizer. So multi-effects pedals incorporated this, expression pedals, but you know, there's also guitars that have had these modifications in their hardwire to produce a sound that replicates that of a synthesizer. So that's what Iron Maiden experimented with a little bit on this album, and it was apparently quite controversial for reasons I don't understand, other than just that they were a heavy metal band that was strict guitars, bass, drums, and no other fluffy instrumentation or experimentation going on up to that point. And then when a heavy metal band wants to experiment a little bit, usually there's a strong backlash initially from a large percentage of their fan base. Not everyone, but a large percentage of people just find it distasteful and they don't like it. I don't get it. The other thing I'd say is that the presence of these guitar synths in Somewhere in Time is so minimal, you can barely hear it. I hear it a little bit at the beginning of the first track, Caught Somewhere in Time. I really have a hard time hearing something that I think would be a guitar synthesizer elsewhere throughout the album. Very minimal. They're blended in the sonic fabric of the album in a way that does not detract at all. If anything, it just adds to the overall soundscape of the album, which is very futuristic, and I think that was kind of what they were shooting for here. So that does kind of bring us to the tracks on the album. So it starts with the great album opener of over 7 minutes long, essentially the title track for the album, Caught Somewhere in Time. Immediately upon hearing those first few guitar notes, the tones of the guitar, the feel, you're transported into like this futuristic world. And it's fabulous. Great musicianship throughout the album, and that song's a great way to kick off the album. You're transported into this kind of futuristic world with all of these things that might be going on, adventures and whatnot. And I think that some general themes of the album that have been documented before are things like space and time, although the band has said they weren't thinking about it conceptually like that, just kind of the way it came out. So after that, we have the second track, Wasted Years. An immediately recognizable song for any Iron Maiden fan. Adrian Smith, credit for that. Very melodic and has an exceptional guitar hook with that opening tapping that he's doing. After that, continues on with Sea of Madness, a very melodic song. Has great momentum throughout, but then in the middle it has this section where it all kind of just calms down a little bit, has some nice guitar textures in it, some more atmosphere, and then it kind of finishes strong. And then the first side of the vinyl, if you have the vinyl, finishes with Heaven Can Wait, which is another very melodic song, a very melodic chorus that can get stuck in your head easily. If you have the vinyl, the second side of the vinyl has some really, really great songs on it, beginning with one of my favorite deep cuts from Iron Maiden, the song The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. Great song that has some charging percussion by Nico McBrain, almost speed metal-like, some fabulous guitar licks between Dave Murray and Adrian Smith. Great vocals, great thoughtful lyrics. Thinking about the long distance of a runner, maybe a person going through life, the marathon of life, and what kind of emotions what kind of emotions are stirred up by the successes and failures of life. It's a very thought-provoking song for me, and one I've always really liked. After that, we have the other big single that came off the album, which was Stranger in a Strange Land. I believe inspired by a story of an explorer in the Arctic that died, froze to death, and his body was discovered like 100 years later. And I think from there, Iron Maiden took it to be like, well, what if this person came back to life then? Indeed, they would be a stranger in a strange land. After that, we have the song Deja Vu, another deep cut in the Iron Maiden catalog and on this album in itself that I think is really good. Very thought-provoking lyrics exploring the phenomenon of deja vu. You know, have I had this experience before? Have I seen this person before? And the internal dialogue that arises in your brain from that. Deja vu is a very strange experience, and it's cool to hear a heavy metal band provide thoughtful, intelligent lyrics on an interesting psychological phenomenon. And then the album finishes with this big epic, Alexander the Great. Like this leader or king of Macedonia from a couple thousand years ago or whatever. This is like one of those Iron Maiden history lessons that they're sometimes known for. This song would be a great song for them to perform live, and I know a lot of other Iron Maiden fans have suggested that. I certainly would concur. I'd love to see them perform this live sometime in a concert. So that wraps up the song. So there you go. Somewhere in Time from 1986. I think that it's a fabulous album and kind of a sleeper album in the Iron Maiden catalog. That's why I wanted to put it under the microscope, even though it's from that classic period from 1980 to 1988. It falls between Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, which came after it, and Power Slave, which came before it. And it's usually not at the top of anyone's favorite Iron Maiden album list. But I've been listening to the songs on here again recently. I've always liked it, but recently I've been hearing some new things or absorbing some things differently about it. That's really very interesting to me. So it's very fresh to me again for some reason. I love this futuristic sonic architecture that's throughout the album. Of course, it's a Martin Birch production who they worked with for so long, from 1981 to 1992. It sounds great like that with the tones and what they're doing throughout the album. And I've also always loved this album artwork. I think Seventh Son of a Seventh Son is maybe my favorite Iron Maiden album cover art, but this is close behind it. I've always loved the futuristic version of like Eddie as a cyborg in this distant world, maybe in a distant galaxy, and what is going on here. There's a lot of details, and you can see up to the moon and the stars. I would actually get quite transfixed and mesmerized with this album art when I would see it. I distinctly remember as a kid seeing this in a music store in a mall that we'd sometimes go to, and just see this and be immediately transported in and start having thoughts come up in my imagination about what is really going on here, and come up with these stories and trying to figure it out. Some truly great album artwork. Anyway, Somewhere in Time, Iron Maiden. If you haven't spent a good quality amount of time with this, please do so. Anyway, thanks, and I'll see you again.